Okay, I think we might get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Nimmo, and I'm going to be emceeing the talk tonight. This is the first of the Randwick City Council Architecture Talks for 2021. Tonight we're showcasing the Newmarket Stage 1 development in South Randwick. A little bit of housekeeping. Can I ask that you all have your microphones on mute unless you're speaking? And also just a note that council are recording tonight's session as well. First up though, I would like to invite the Randwick City Mayor, Danny Said, to say a few words and to provide an acknowledgement of country. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all those who are attending tonight. I'd like to welcome everyone to this year's first presentation as part of the Randwick City Architecture Talks series, and thank you for all joining us. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Bidjigal and Gadigal people who are traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. After a year-long break in 2020, we're excited to once again use these talks to share and celebrate design excellence in our community. Randwick City Council is well known for promoting architectural design excellence within our local government area. Right across the city, we can see examples of great architecture and urban design that symbolise design excellence. Places like the Prince Henry site at Little Bay, the UNSW campus, as well as multi-housing projects, new homes and renovations across the city, and of course our community projects such as the Kensington Park Community Centre and the Des Renford Leisure Centre. Through our successful biennial architecture awards, we continue to recognise these projects in our city that demonstrate a commitment to outstanding design outcomes, creating vibrant, livable and attractive places for our local residents and businesses. Our popular architectural talk series held each year is an important pillar of the agenda. The talks provide an avenue for community to learn more about the design process, as well as actively engage with the architects and designers responsible for creating the award-winning built environments within Randwick City Council. This engagement is particularly important as we navigate through COVID-19 and what it's meant to our communities. The pandemic has seen greater focus on the importance of good city design, including access to high quality civic and public spaces. Over the last 18 months, we've seen how important things like wider footpaths and local public parks are to allow social distancing and outdoor exercise. In June 2020, a survey from the Department of Planning showed 46% of people in Sydney spent more time in public spaces than before coronavirus restrictions. These figures show how important it is for our communities to have well-located, high-quality outdoor spaces, not only for exercise, but to foster social connections. It is well documented that feeling part of the community is good for our mental health, and our local support networks have become even more important during COVID-19. The pandemic has also brought to light the importance of our business centres and the role of local government in supporting economic recovery. With more people working from home and staying in their local area, walkable environments with paths and cycleways are providing safe spaces for getting to places such as local shops, cafes, restaurants, supermarkets, parks and playgrounds. Therefore fitting that this year's first talk focuses on the Newmarket Precinct in South Randwick, an exciting new destination for our community. The Newmarket design, including our three panellists, have transformed this site into a vibrant mixed-use precinct that is sensitive of its rich equestrian heritage and surrounding urban context. As a massive thank you to Matthew Allen from Boat Smart, William Smart from Smart Design Studio, and Alex Longley, Arcadia Landscape Architecture, for sharing with us the design process of Randwick's latest precinct development. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to our marvellous NC, Andrew Nimmo. And Andrew Nimmo is an immediate past president of the New South Wales Australian Institute of Architects and has facilitated the architecture talks for Randwick City Council since 2012. It is a pleasure to have you back, and Andrew will be facilitating the question and answer session following the panel presentation. I highly encourage all attendees to participate in the Q&A discussions with the design panel and following the talks. Now, without further ado, I'd like to pass you back to Andrew to introduce the panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for those kind words. And yes, it's been a couple of years since the last talk. COVID has put a bit of a dampener on things. But tonight we thought we'd have a go at doing a virtual format. This is the first one, so please, everyone be patient. There may be a few hiccups and teething problems along the way, but we'll do our best. As the Mayor mentioned, we have three speakers tonight, who between them will cover the urban design, the landscape architecture, and the architecture of Newmarket Stage 1. Now, the format will be that the speakers will talk for around about 45 minutes in total. I will then initiate a few questions of my own to get a bit of a discussion going and a Q&A going, and then we'll open it up to the floor for some questions from our viewers. Now, if you want to ask a question, you can either use the reactions tab if you're familiar with Zoom and raise your hand, and then I'll ask you to unmute and you can ask your question. Alternatively, you can type your question into the chat function, and we will try and get to as many questions as we can. But please do not start asking your question unless you're prompted, and please be patient because we've got quite a few people here and chances are we won't get a chance to take everyone's questions. Now, our first speaker tonight is Matt Allen, who will talk about the master plan at Newmarket. Matt's a director at Bates Smart's Sydney studio. Since joining Bates Smart in 2009, he's worked across residential, student housing, hotel and civic work, building particular expertise in residential master plans. He led the multi-firm master plan for Newmarket, the design of the Newmarket residences, and is currently working on Young and Finelli, next phase of the Newmarket development. He'll be followed by Alex Longley, who will speak about the landscape and public domain. Alex is a founding principal of Arcadia landscape architecture. Over the past 20 years, Alex has designed and coordinated a range of large-scale and community-focused projects. Apart from the work Arcadia has done with the team at Newmarket, another recent project is the canopy at Lane Cove. And then we'll have William Smart, who will show us Fig Tree Pocket. William founded Smart Design Studio in 1997, and his practice seems to be going from strength to strength, garnering state and national awards from the Australian Institute of Architects with increasing regularity. And then finally, Matt Allen will come back again and he will talk about the Newmarket residences and do a bit of a wrap up. So Matt, are you just about ready to take over?
Yeah, I think I can probably do that, Andrew. I just need to share screen. I'm hoping that's visible to everybody. No?
Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. Great. Well, thanks for the introduction, both Mr. Mayor and Andrew. It's a real privilege to be here tonight to share some of our the thinking that's gone into this project over the years. Yeah, we've been lucky enough to be involved working with council on this since 2016, I think it was, and supported wholly by Cbus Property, who are the developer of the recent master plan. So yeah, we've been on a fantastic journey over that time, and yeah, looking forward to sharing some of that with you tonight. Just bear with me. Yeah, I'd also just, before I start, like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the traditional owners of country, in particular the Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples who traditionally occupied the Sydney coast. So I'm sure as locals, most of you will know the site reasonably well. For those that don't know it, the Newmarket is the site of the former Inglis stables, which is just on the southern edge of the Randwick Health and Education Precinct. The hospital's immediately to the north, and you can see where we're in South Randwick, kind of halfway between Moore Park and Coogee Beach. The site has an incredible history of horse racing and these magnificent fig trees that were planted, many of them over 100 years ago, and this equestrian history and the magnificent landscape really impressed upon us early in the design process. As I said, we've been working on the master plan since 2016. This is a site plan showing the whole of the master plan, of which what we're talking about today is the first stage. So here you can see Barca Street to the north, Randwick Girls and Boys High to the east, Avoca Street just off the page there to the right, Rainbow Street Primary and Payne Reserve to the south of the site, and Botany Street running north-south on the left-hand side of the page. The site was master planned in 3 stages. The first stage, which is coloured here, the Eastern Precinct, is the one that's been completed. That's what we're mainly talking to you about today. And the second stage, which you might have seen, apartments are currently being sold for the second stage at the moment, runs down the new street, Fennelly Street, to connect into Botany Street, and the final stage where the existing sales suite will come online in future years. I'm just going to take you through a few diagrams which shape some of the key moves of the master plan. So this is a drawing which is now turned around 90 degrees, confusingly. So this is just looking at the Eastern Precinct now. So Barca Street now is on the left-hand side of the page, and the Rainbow Street Primary is on the right-hand side of the page. The key things that really influenced our master plan thinking are set out on these following diagrams. The existing trees I mentioned earlier are all absolutely incredible, a mix of figs, a Norfolk Island pine, scattered around the site amongst the existing buildings. You can see those all coloured here in green. There's 3 important heritage buildings within the Eastern Precinct. They're coloured orange here. The sales ring, Alex will talk to in a bit about how that's been repurposed into a playground. Newmarket House alongside the new park, and the big stable down the south end of the site. Here's a couple of images of those. So this is what the site looked like in 2016 when we started work, when it was still occupied by the Inglis family and used for the annual horse sales. That's the big stable in front of you there. Looks a bit different how it does today. Here it's still fully enclosed in glazing with this roof and has kind of stadium seating inside. This is Newmarket House, which for those of you who've been to the site will recognise this alongside the park. This is the old family house of the Inglis family, and this is currently going through the process of being converted into a childcare centre. And then down the south end of the site, the third building, the big stable, it's a magnificent space. For those of you who have been fortunate enough to be inside, it's a really expressive open structure. Council are currently working on what the future plans might be in store for that. So just going back to our diagrams, you can see here the same setup, the trees, the heritage buildings. One of the key planks of our master plan was how to get cars in and around the site and how to give addresses to all of these buildings. So we proposed a loop road that comes between the park and the dining precinct, wraps along the eastern boundary and then returns back to meet Young Street alongside the big stable. And this new street gives vehicle access to the front doors of all the buildings on the rear boundary and could in future provide further connections and openings into the schools. That vehicular link is coupled with a strong pedestrian axial link. So that provides a clear sight line through the middle of the site, all the way from Barca Street down to the big stable. And that one of the key moves of the master plan was using that link to provide a series of very different public spaces, each with their own character. So just moving from left to right, that's the Retail Plaza, which is the main hardscape space between the two buildings alongside Barca Street, with the retail spaces alongside. The public park with the playground, the lawn space and the garden. The Communal Garden for the residents of Fig Tree Pocket, which has gates that are open for the majority of the day so people can walk through, and then that lawn forecourt out the front of the big stable. Alex will talk you through these spaces in a lot more detail. And then finally, the massing of the apartment buildings on the site. What we did is arrange all the apartment buildings either side of that central axis, and then we reduced the heights of the buildings alongside all the heritage buildings to address those existing buildings in a more sensitive way. Now, just before I hand over to Alex, who'll go through all the landscape spaces in a bit more detail, I just thought I'd give you a couple of images just to put some of those master plan moves in context. Here we are standing at the south end of the park, looking northward towards Barca Street, and you can see the big stable in its current form on the right, and the dining precinct to the north. That's the sales ring playground Alex will talk to, and then just another example of where the heritage structures and the heritage trees have really been brought together and celebrated. I think that's over to you, Alex. Do you want to share your own screen to go through the landscape?
I'm good to go.
Great. I'll just stop sharing.
All there? Is that
Yep, I can see that.
okay? Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Mayor and Andrew, for the introduction. First of all, when we started working with Bates Smart on the master plan some 6 and a bit years ago, it was what immediately struck out to us to be an absolute privilege to work on a project in a site like this, a site that had been predominantly owned privately for over 100 years, had a very sort of quiet and ambient sort of nature to it for 95% of the year, and then for a week before Easter and then during the Easter yearling sales, you'd have several thousands of people and hundreds of horses come here to spend millions of dollars on Australia's thoroughbred industry. And it took on a completely new life. And so whilst the buildings have all been designed for the new users and have great opportunities to deliver, whether it's food and beverage or residential amenity, our responsibility really was to stitch the place together so that it sung as one place, but also to harness and to make sure that we instilled the old of yesterday into the future of tomorrow for the new residents and the new community to really understand and to cherish what was here once, and to recognise and to pay tribute to that industry that's a very important part of Australia's culture.
Alex, can I just ask you to lean forward a little bit and speak up? Yeah, thank you.
Right,
Yep. People having trouble. That's it.
Right.
Thank you.
And so as part of that, and part of our design journey, we spend a lot of time doing research, and with the works of some of the historians and our own research, we started to establish, I suppose, and unpick the very diverse amount of elements that actually sit on the site, apart from the three main elements in our in the first stage, and I suppose the variety of different equestrian uses that were so predominant within the site. And it was actually as part of the construction programming and the excavation processes, there was a historian on site for the entire dig. And that's where some of the bricks that you would be familiar with in the site have been discovered. And down here in the number 8, which is down to the bottom right-hand side of the page as an example, some 1 meters below the existing level, we discovered that ring, that red ring, actually had buried bricks that had been down there, some of them with even containing convict sort of stamps on them. So it was all these heritage elements really sort of became very important for us to discover and then to reinterpret. And I suppose part of that is the architecture and that typical sort of architectural form that the stables had driven out. The parade grounds is also a significant sort of element of what the equestrian sort of heritage sort of drove out. And then also the probably the most significant heritage item on the site, in our opinion at least, as landscape architects, is the central fig that sits now proudly in the middle of the park and is its cornerstone, I suppose, of the park itself. It was planted over, I think, 112 years ago now, And it's really witnessed the sale of every horse that ever was paraded within these grounds and sold under the hammer. So its structure within the park was essential to really celebrate. And notwithstanding that, the Inglis's, whilst the site was contained and fenced and only for private use the majority of the year, that when those fences opened up and the public could come through, their home and their garden became part of the public space for those few days of the year. But also importantly, what was very noticeable was that whilst there were fences that surrounded the perimeter of the site, that visually they always allowed for the permeability to come through. And that was something that was really sort of picked up, I suppose, and identified as part of our approach to the future of the residential components. And in Williams' portion of the first stage, as Matt sort of talked about, there's an element of that is, sort of made public and accessible throughout the day. And then there's a private communal space that is somewhat fenced off, but completely permeable. And that for us is an important part of the site's character and the site's history to instill and to take forward into the site moving forward. Matt sort of touched on the existing trees scattered around the site. I think there's 15 heritage listed trees, which are a mixture of figs and the Norfolk Island pines. Every one of those has been planned to be retained. We've stepped basements around them, done everything possible to ensure that the planting allowed for their retention, and that these iconic components of the existing site really became cornerstones of the overall development itself. From a master plan level, we really looked at probably 4 main pillars. The connections, both within the pedestrian sort of connections and the vehicular connections. There's a series of new roads that come through the space. Accessibility, believe it or not, there's something like 1.5 metre fall from Barca Street down to the park, and even through the retail zone. There's a reasonably tricky sort of fall that occurs through there. So being able to make sure that we didn't impose handrails and those sorts of elements through there was part of our design processes. Obviously, the heritage reinterpretation took on a very important part of the design and the consideration, and then a defining character that really sort of created not something that only tied the site together, but really sort of created a new precinct for Randwick. We are really in quite close proximity to the spot and to Randwick Junction, and we needed Newmarket to take on its own life and its own sense of place. So the connections, I think Matt sort of talked through these, but we have this main pedestrian spine that heads from north to south through the centre of the site, and is really the way that we see we are able to get the public to navigate and to enjoy the different types of amenity. The new road that sort of loops around stage 1, and then on the stage 2 side, we have the new roads in the purple there that have been constructed, and you may have already sort of driven around yourselves. In terms of the spaces, the blue here is signifying publicly accessible open spaces, and I think that it's a credit to the developer and their position in reinforcing and encouraging the publicly accessible components to this site. It's not very often that the areas between the buildings, say for Williams component in E2, 3 and 4, that they would be open to the public in the nature that they are. But it really has allowed, I suppose, the landscape to flow quite naturally, but also create these significantly unique spaces. The heritage components, obviously, and then the semi-public accessible spaces that sits in front of the existing big stable. In terms of the heritage interpretation, we were blessed with probably 4 main elements that we really enjoyed working with. the architectural forms, and we adopted those as part of not only some of our ground plane treatments, but definitely the structures that sit within the park. The timber that was a very strong component of the stables that existed, both the old and the new stables that was salvaged and recycled. The bricks that were in the stables floors where all the horses sort of walked over, we salvaged all of those. And then as part of the civil works within Young Street itself, during the removal of and upgrading of the curb and guttering, council had requested us to replace the gutter, but to retain the old sandstone heritage curbs. And so we were able to pick up basically, almost 1.5 kilometres of this sandstone, and that allowed us to introduce that into forming up part of the framework of the park itself, which you'll see later on. Placemaking and activation. I think, we've got a very busy pedestrian driven Barca Street, it's high velocity of traffic, getting in and around Randwick, but also to the hospital entrance directly across the road, universities down the street, and the local schools, coming through into the middle of the two buildings on Barca Street, where we sort of have these focused social zones that then bleed into the park. And we'll explain how our thinking was approached there in terms of not having the park and that retail component be two isolated elements, that we wanted to stitch them together and for them to be expansions of one another. The community gathering / recreational space is the big lawn in the middle, and then the local shared spaces that are scattered around in the blue. Vegetation character. So this is really sort of just looking at the different approaches to the central park and social spaces versus Young Street and Barca Street, and then the new streets that have been planted up. So this is the master plan as it sits today. You'll see in some of the future slides that the actual form of the plans is what we actually had at different stages of our design development. And I thought it was important for us to just acknowledge as designers that what we present at different stages of our processes is not what we always see fixed in concrete. And I think that for good purpose and good reason and collaboration and working with council and the other designers that come into the project through its life cycle, is that there's an evolution. And this is pretty true to what's represented on the site today. And I think that you'll sort of get an understanding, especially around the park, where some of the line work has evolved on the future stages. So on E1, or the retail precinct itself, there's really two main components to that. There's the publicly accessible component on Barca and Young Street, where we've provided, I suppose, pedestrian connections as a primary sort of driver, and then tried to really create really high quality al fresco dining amenity with the use of shade structures and the like that would allow the success of the F&B retailers to spill out and to allow a really good quality of activation on those edges. The central food and beverage precinct that really worked quite heavily to make sure that whilst it serves a purpose for the retailers to expand their floor plates and to be able to trade and to provide service and the amenity to their customers in an outdoor experience, that there was a significantly high proportion of public amenity that sat in there, and that you weren't that the diners that got say a burger from Cafe Mackenzie, that they didn't feel as though they're excluded from using this space. So the furniture layout and the fixed furniture really sort of assisted us in doing that, and we've sort of worked quite hard in making sure that the spaces that aligned with the different retailers are very clear, and they've dressed those themselves every day. They bring in their own furniture and character, but ultimately the rest of the amenity is very clear that it's for public use and for general public amenity, and that allows for for people to come through and for it not to be an exclusive place just for dining. And then lastly, onto the right-hand side of the page is the more private residential approach that comes into the E1 Eastern building, where there's a bit of a gated component and then a little private tranquil open space that allows for some passive recreation for the residents of that building. In terms of the structure of the design, we look to activate the windows of the F&B retailers, and then to have two main spines of pedestrian that sit outside that, that then lead into this central town square, as we sort of have referred to it, with that beautiful water feature that sits in it with the struggle town interpretation. That space has been sort of designed and considered as a flexible space. We expect when we have a COVID-free Christmas and the planning has a little bit more assurance, that the intention is that stage or that element gets covered, and that there's opportunities for Christmas trees to get put up on there. That it becomes a place that can be used for a variety of different community-based uses as well. The awning element over the top, I want to make some reference to, because Arcadia, whilst we're involved in the planning of all the seating and everything that sits underneath it, we collaborated, but mostly it was designed by HDR. And for the public, just to understand what it signifies, is that the cones that sit underneath it are obviously the horseshoes, and the movement underneath it is representative of the sand dunes that once occupied the site. So that there's that touching back, I suppose, on First Nations people's knowledge and experience of the site, and then sort of using it as a very modern, slick element that provides fantastic amenity for the diners in all seasons. So just coming through into a few images, this is the structure that I'm talking about. It's such a beautifully lit element at night, but in the daytime it still holds its own purpose. The central sort of spaces here, and we can sort of see here that the diners have, and this is a Baccamata, they're sort of sitting there within the Baccamata furniture, but off to the right-hand side where those stools are, they're clearly part of that communal offering. And then this is around the water feature with these children sitting in the water feature with their feet in that. It was 100% the intention. I saw it at Newport Arms, one of Justin Hems's success stories, where the kids were, in that central water feature there. And I thought, it's such a fantastic opportunity. It's removed from the street, and it gives the parents a little bit of respite for, 10 to 15 minutes while they can have a coffee and a bit of peace. But all the way through this, there's a whole layer of interpretation. The bricks are very important, the reuse of the timber. And then in the ground plane, where this girl is on the left-hand side in the blue, when you get out there next time, there's a whole series of plaques that are there that talk about the history of the site from pre-colonial days all the way through on a timeline, and it sort of steps across both sides of the plaza. And then as the Inglisses start to come into place, there are some colours of the horses. And what that's important about is this is not a place where the jockeys were celebrated or the trainers, that's the track. This is where the horses were sold. So this is representative of the studs, I suppose, of the industry. And those colours represent the studs and the racing colours that the horses then went on to use. And as part of that interpretation, each building has been aligned with one of the predominant horses that Arthur Inglis and his family assisted us in selecting. And they're the ones that are scattered throughout the ground plane of this landscape. And we've really looked to create, lush spaces, but with great passive surveillance. There's no nasty little corners. But at the same time, that these ladies sitting there are in a place that would be somewhat removed from people on the other side of that garden bed and not be staring at each other as though you're in a food court of Westfield. And then this sort of just looks at, I suppose, a more tranquil part of the evening, the water feature there, and, people using this spine and all the way down through to the park and picking up on the success of that that axis that really connects that beautiful old stable at the southern end of the site through to we're almost, at the most northern part of it. So if I come into the park itself now, the design drivers was basically to create a large lawn space that looked to provide passive and active recreation, a place for kids, a place for flexible community gatherings, barbecue amenity, and an extension of the food and beverage area, and then general play. And within the site, the main networks or drivers, I suppose, were these fantastic canopy trees that existed on site. We obviously have the main fig that sits in the centre of the site. Adjacent to the Inglis house, there's two other figs that are sitting within the park itself, but obviously providing amenity to the house and that edge of the park. The standard camphor laurels that are along Young Street, and then the other figs on the edge of the school, and then just to the south, this smaller lighter green symbol represents the Norfolk Island pine that's on the site at the moment. The structure of the site itself, like when we sort of first saw that the sales ring, I'd actually seen it for a fair few years before, but Mike, my business partner, and I sort of looked at it, and it was the biggest puzzle of what we could do with it, but it had such a strong presence that it needed to remain and to be retained in some form. And I think whilst it's been sort of discussed as heritage, I wouldn't say that it's got architectural heritage value, but in terms of its cultural value and its cultural heritage, it holds a great deal of importance, and especially to that community that had passed the baton on to the next group. So retaining that for us was very important. And we quickly discovered that if we were to strip off all the glazing and all the wind loading that was going to come off on it, we had a reasonably robust and structurally over-engineered element that then we could look to hang potentially a playground off, and to get that level of experience on multiple layers instead of having a traditional flat playground. In addition to that, to make that playground successful, we sort of saw that that there's other elements that make a park great, and there's obviously the big lawn, that deck that sort of sits up there that allows for a whole range of sort of elements that kids, yoga classes, gym instructors, buskers, etc., have used already, and that's without the procurement that has always been planned. But then also the dining amenity for both local residents, but also as overspill, I suppose, for the F&B retailers to the north. And so with those, we sort of started to be able to stitch things together, and it made logical sort of sense in terms of sort of finding this arrangement, I suppose. Not without saying that the circulation in and around the space is very important. And one of the challenges that we had was to retain the structure, and some of those bleachers that are there that create the elevation and the height was ensuring that we provided a safe space for all days of the year and all hours of the day. And whilst the lighting does some form, I think that we've opened it up significantly so that there's no little nooks or crannies for any sort of opportunities for predators of the like either. So just coming through these, I suppose, some character images. This is, sort of an early image that we found of a sort of really sort of interesting play space in America, but it really started to drive out some of that look and feel. Even I suppose, the equestrian or agricultural components of the site and the character started to sort of come into our minds, which is where we sort of arrived at the structure of this is what has been designed and what's been instilled now. So we've got the main pedestrian spine. I think it's 4 meters in width. It sort of connects the north to the south, but also this east-west connection that comes off Young Street and sits right in the centre line of the axis of the centre of the play structure. The raised deck around the FIG itself. The FIG it sits at a slightly higher level than the adjacent surfaces, so we needed to sort of treat that with its due requirements to make sure that it had a healthy and well aired soil base. And then wrapping around that is the L-shaped or food and beverage or park dining amenity. And the first one that runs on the east-west axis adjacent to the New Street is what we envisaged to be, and it's exactly every time we go there, it's funny how things sort of work out for you, that we saw that being the spill out space. People would go to the different restaurants with their friends, and someone would go to the dumpling place, someone would go to the cafe, someone would go and get a slice of pizza from Barca, and they'd all come here, grab a bottle of wine from Stella, and you know, sort of sit there. The kids can frolic around in the park. You've got half an eye on them. You know exactly what's going on, but you're not within that proper sort of more, I suppose, structured dining space. And then coming around to the other side is where we sort of have that communal barbecue area, which, you know, provides that weekend slash evening sort of opportunity for the local community. Not only local Newmarket residents, but the other community from broader places. And then down to the bottom of the park space, the number 8 is really where we've sort of identified that we've created a very high velocity active space for probably kids from the age of, say, 5 or 6 through to 6 or 16 to 20. I've actually been down the slide, and some of our clients that have been there for lunch too. So it's that we needed to provide a more tranquil and passive space for the younger kids. So the planning of that is that the younger kids have been sort of provided their own dining amenity. And if you have a look down the bottom there, there's some miniature tables that are made out of the sandstone and recycled timber for kids' parties, you know, like for 4-year-olds and the like. So these are just some images rolling through. You can sort of see that sandstone on the right-hand side of the image that created that level change. From a water sensitive urban design perspective, the turf area has been designed as a detention basin for heavy flood events before it sort of trickles over and goes down Young Street. But being in the sandy soil it drains very, very quickly. Recycled bricks that you can see. And then I think that the arbor structure that sort of sits over this area here is, you know, a good indication about where we've looked at the old architectural forms of the stables to assist us in providing the structure of those landscape structures. And then obviously we've got the fig tree and you know this beautiful natural sculptural element to the left, and then this ridiculously fun and, you know, 300 kids on it, you know, at 4 o'clock every afternoon going bananas. And just, you know, beside it, it's been a fun project to work and to see a community adopt so well. And then this is that passive dining amenity with the what you'd call tractor seats, I suppose. Just trying to get that another layer of that sort of agricultural or equestrian heritage in on it. There was a brand culture is probably worth mentioning. They did a whole body of work with this heritage interpretation, and around the main tree there's 4 images that date back throughout its lifespan. You can see on the right hand image, I think that's from 1908, which is one of the early images that you've seen. This one's 1937, I think, and then there's one that's with a more recent photo with the existing or the old sales ring that's in there. Central play area that has a massive horseshoe motif on it as part of that additional heritage interpretation, and then the elevated play elements. The sightline through to the Newmarket, the big stable there. And then these are some images that are within Williams Smart Design Studios garden, I suppose, the communal garden, where we provide that pedestrian link from north to south. And these planes, again, are talking to the heritage of the old stable roof forms, but then have allowed us to get adequate soil volumes for the trees to be able to grow successfully in. And then this is looking in at the private communal open space. The basement at this point steps around, obviously, to allow the roots of this tree to be retained. And then that gate closes off so that this is a semi-private space. But as I said in the beginning, very visually permeable and not, you know, sort of closed off from that public sightline and connection. And this is from the Loop Road looking back through into the central spine. So William, I'll stop here, and I think Matt, you're going to take control. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'd just like to present a little bit about the Fig Tree Pocket. The project really started with us being very mindful of the amount of amenity available on this site and how we could connect in with the gardens. What we were really thinking about is the rising sun in summer and winter and how you could use that and the architecture to control the amount of summer sun coming in, so to limit that, but to allow the winter sun in. This is sort of a diagram that compares a normal configuration where you would have western facing glass and some louvers, or this configuration where we use big solid blade walls to shade the sun. In this case, in summer, those big angled walls prevent the living room from getting sun on the glass in the afternoon. And then in winter, it works the other way because the sun sets further north in the sky, the setting sun comes into the apartment, so you get more sun in winter, less sun in summer. We use that really to drive the architecture and then coupled that with an idea of privacy and how to enhance privacy between apartments that were looking towards each other. So these angled blade walls directed your views down the gardenscape towards Barca Road. The angled blade walls you can see form the architecture, and as well as that, the master plan had heights of buildings at different heights. So some of them were 7 meters, 3 meters, and 4 meter elements. So we angled big blade walls towards the north to control the sun and the privacy, and then united it all with the expression of 3-story slabs that ran through all the buildings. This is an early sketch from the concept stage where we saw that direct expression of linking everything together and the solar control would create the architecture. And it was one consistent language that ran through everything, that drew its heights from the stable shed to the south and also to the house to the north. These were early sketches, just talking a bit about the opportunity through there that the balconies would give depth to the architecture, so it kind of feels alive and deep, and how we would establish relationships to adjacent buildings so that, in particular, this lawn space to the north of the old stables would become a really beautiful space to be in that's both sunny and appropriately scaled. And then looking to the north on that, these were early sketches again on how we would try to unite that. And then looking at the whole master plan as we developed that up in CAD. And then the building from above. So what you can really see through here is a polished concrete set of slabs that are vertical, that wrap up and over and become clerestory windows on the high level, and the in situ concrete horizontal slabs that unite all the buildings together. From the north, the building presents as very open because it's really facing this way that we want to let that winter sun in. From the south, by contrary, it's quite different, so it's much more enclosed, and we're using that big solid wall to shade that summer sun coming into the apartments. And then on the north and the south, we have an expression of a brise-soleil, which is really used to control privacy and sun coming into those glass facades. A similar language is adopted to the central space, but these angled walls give you privacy between the units as well, because it directs your view down towards the gardens and the public spaces on the north. And then in the central garden, which was conceived as a garden rather than a public place, so it was intended to be a quiet, calm space and for that to be very different to the more active areas towards Barca Road, we really had an opportunity to make that open to the public. So it opens during the day and then closes off at night. And every time we built stairs and ledges, we were really thinking about places for people to sit and drink a coffee or just to take a break. At the top of the building, the big blade walls wrap up and over and forms a high level clerestory roof. So the ceilings are 4 meters high at that part. And then through that, you can see that the expression of the balustrade, which is made up of a series of vertical angles, is really designed as a screening element that wraps around the south of the building to form a spandrel. We're really conscious of making private apartments for people whilst retaining a lot of light into the units. And then details of how the gates interface with some bleachers there to the south side and looking back towards the lawn. And then the plans from above, just showing configurations of the units. To achieve cross ventilation, we split a couple of the buildings into 2 cores, so they separate. So you have through units at the center of the building. And then as you go higher through the building, shorter forms stack up through there. And then this is one of the smaller buildings. So this one is 5 stories high, whereas the other ones are 7. So a single element that's 5 stories high, and you can see the expression adapts to the south and the north sides. And then looking at that building from the northern end and how it interfaces with the park around the big fig tree. Each of the buildings was the same material palette, but had a different colour trim. So the balustrades and windows were different. The one on the left is a very dark green. The one on the right is an aubergine colour. And we drew all those colours from the buildings neighbouring. So it's hard to see, but the slate roof to the old house is a very similar colour to the purple. And we tried to match and complement the existing elements around there. And we then tied it back into the colours for the interiors, which were related to the horses, after which the buildings were named. This is a smaller building out the back, which is very simple. And the brise-soleil details were all made out of precast concrete with a polished finish. But for us, it's really important to think about how those elements come together and are expressive. And then signage is integrated into the project. And the connections with the public domain are really critical. And then this is the space between 2 of the buildings, which is a gathering space for the residents of the building. So it's got barbecue facilities here. And then inside the units, you see a very simplified palette. So we love these kind of simple interiors with integrated appliances and special details in the floor and cove lighting in the ceilings. And then running that detail into elements like the air conditioning being well integrated. And there you see the kitchen. And a little hob through there with a stone bench top. And then running through the bathrooms there, you see a very similar palette of stone and integrated fixtures and fittings where you don't see the cisterns or the buttons for the toilet. Thank you.
Thanks, William. I think that's back to me just to give a brief overview of the 2 buildings alongside Barca Street. So Newmarket residences comprise 2 8-story buildings just to the north of the park. Like William's building, we've used a precast concrete open frame expression to define the architecture of the building. And while the 2 concretes are exactly the same mix, where William's got a polished finish, ours is in a sandblasted finish. The open frame has subtly different treatments to each of the orientations, responding to the unique conditions of each of those facades. And we've broken up the consistent frame with a play of volumes by pushing and pulling elements forwards and backwards to break up that otherwise regular frame. The 2 buildings have very similar mirrored floor plates. So here I'm just showing one. This is the Western building. So this has 11 apartments and uses 2 separate cores, so 2 separate sets of stairs and lifts. to maximise the number of dwellings that have more than one orientation, so that have dual aspect. That's because corner apartments and dual aspect apartments have really great amenity through cross ventilation and sun from different directions. We've used the balconies to break up the form. And so that's both balconies on the corners where the corner of the frame is missing. And we've also got these recessed balconies which break up the length of the facade, making the building read in three, the long facade building read in three parts. Here I've just zoomed in on the southwest apartment, so in the bottom corner of the building, where you can looking at it in a little more detail. And here you can see the repeating window bays and corner balconies, giving a real sense of openness and connection to the outdoors. From the outside, that's that apartment we were just looking at. Here you can see one of those building breaks with the recessed balcony, breaking down that length of that overall facade. The shading is achieved subtly differently on each of the orientations. This is the northern facade, where the concrete slabs are extended outwards to provide horizontal shading, which keeps out the summer sun and lets in the winter sun. Whereas on the western facades, these angled louvers in the same tone as the precast concrete provide that protection from the setting western sun. Here you get a sense of the building's expression of those repeating precast concrete bays, the open corners, and the play of different elements, picture windows, fins, and so on. Here's the view of those picture windows within the apartments, and the corner balconies opening up into the treescape of the park to the south. The ground level is defined by the new dining precinct, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which connects Barca Street through to the park. 12 different retail tenancies activate all those frontages, while the compact apartment lobbies connect through from the street through to that central space. Here's access into the eastern building. Alex made mention of this, the garden along the eastern boundary of the site, which provides an entry garden under the shade of those 3 or 4 heritage trees there. And here actually you can see the allusion Alex made earlier to the celebration of the horses. Each of the buildings has a celebration of one of the jockey silks. This one's celebrates black caviar. So you can see the pink jockey silk with the black polka dots there, which are then interpreted in the design of the lobby. There's a plaque with a bit of information about the history of the horse there. Sorry. Here you can see that linear lobby I showed you in plan, which connects the external space all the way through to the plaza on the other side of the building. And the interior design of the lobby picking up the framed expression of the building on the outside. And between the two buildings, the retail plaza provides that north-south connection, the outdoor dining spaces, and that public seating available all day that Alex described earlier. Here, the building architecture comes to ground with those precast concrete columns coming all the way down and forming framed bays, which the retail tenants occupy. Those frame bays allow the tenants to spill out into that open space between, into that north-south link. And it's in that link that the horse racing history is celebrated again. These are the plaques Alex was referring to earlier with a bit of a timeline of what's happened on this site in the past, and the jockey silks of some of the famous horses celebrated in inlays in the ground. The central canopy, which Alex showed you earlier, here by day, you can see the horseshoes and the undulating plane he described, designed by HDR, and a real playful element anchoring that space, with really lovely atmosphere in the evening. I think, just in conclusion, I think one of the great successes of this project is how the ongoing and iterative collaboration enables the whole precinct to talk together. So it's been, as we said at the start, it's been a long journey. It wouldn't be the project it is without many collaborators. That started with the Inglis family. We came on board after an initial master plan had been drawn up. We worked really collaboratively with council and the design review panels in the council team over the years. And while Alex and I were working on it from day one, when William and his team joined the project a year later, that just brought a new energy to the project. In terms of the architecture, I think that collaborative relationship is best exemplified by the related but distinct concrete facade expression. This is our precast concrete frame in exactly the same material as William's one on the other side of the park, with a different expression, a different treatment, but buildings that are complementary to one another and in an incredible landscape setting, which Alex and his team has put together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, Alex, and William. That's fantastic. I'm going to kick off a bit of the QA here. My feeling is that in terms of taking questions from the floor, I don't know how easily it's going to work with the putting up your hand function, because we've got over 100 different participants here. It's going to be difficult to try and track them all. So I think if you want to ask a question, typing it into the chat function is probably going to be the most successful. But anyway, I'll kick things off. One thing that occurs to me is multi-residential developments have really been copping a bit of a bad flack in Sydney in the last few years. And in many respects, I think it's probably for good reason. I think there has been some poorly designed and poorly built structures, but multi-residential I believe is so critical for the future of this city, because the city is going to get denser. It needs to get denser. We can't just keep eating up parklands and green fields for new houses and having people traveling further and further to get to where they've got to. We need to get a medium to high density going, which means we need to do it well. And I think when it is done well, it's a fantastic outcome. And this is clearly an example of how to do it well. What occurs to me here is, though, there's a shift. The emphasis is not so much on the buildings, it's actually on the placemaking. And I know placemaking has become the real buzzword now with urban design, that in fact the buildings in some respects almost take sit in the back, and they help to frame and make and shape spaces, but it's the outdoor spaces that are really special. And the architecture here is very, very calm and restrained, and the fun bits are outside with the playgrounds and the canopies and stuff. I'd be interested, it's probably Alex and Matt, but just talking about that shift of emphasis where it's placemaking and space making is what makes a place work, rather than just the buildings.
I feel like I could take another hour and a half just to wax lyrical on that question, Andrew. But it's a really important topic you've touched on. I think the question about how we use, the everyday buildings of our city, it's like housing and offices, those sorts of buildings, to create great places for the community, or frame great places for the community. Yeah, and the proof will be in the pudding at Newmarket, because the bulk of the community space is in this first stage, and the latter two stages help to define streets and front public spaces, but there's no huge gift of community space like the park and the retail precinct in the latter stages. But to your point about the kind of role of buildings in placemaking like this, I think you said it very well, that the buildings are kind of calm and just pay respect to the spaces, do the best they can to provide great amenity for the residents that live there, and leave the real community space for the community and the landscape.
Alex, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that on this particular project, we were really fortunate to be handed, significantly important, not only, but beautiful elements to start to frame the project around. And that the place itself was almost established through that in many respects. And then to be able to sort of, I think that, part of the Inglis's commitment and CBUS's agreement was that the site would be the heritage component would continue to be told. So with the existing elements and then that rich history, it certainly, put us on the front foot straight away.
That one thing that interested me a lot, Alex, you talked about finding convict bricks on site. I'm interested to hear a little bit about, because you talked a lot about the history of the site with horses, and of course it's new history now. But if there's convict bricks on there, then presumably there was even another life before that. So I'd be interested if there's any insights there, but also just that thing where, when we design and document projects, it's all supposed to be finished and then it can happen. But of course, you need to have a level of flexibility so that when you get on site, you can shift and move when you find things that you weren't expecting, or maybe the tree roots perhaps extend further than you thought. So you've got to modify a path or a footing. Or in this case, you might start digging and you find an extraordinary piece of footing from some long forgotten building that really needs to be interpreted and honoured. So is there some more history there that we should know about? And were there any interesting things you came across during the works?
There was certainly, during the excavation, probably more around where the house is, there was some archaeological sort of elements, I suppose, that were found. There were several hundred white clay bottles, that some of them were intact and some of them weren't, that were found. A lot of pottery that was sort of part of, I suppose, that building's old life. It was a hotel at one point in time. And then there was also a bit of ochre that was found that obviously doesn't sit in a sandy environment, and then some indigenous artifacts that were found inside an old hut that was sort of discovered as well, or at least the foundations of an old hut. And they've all been archived and taken off for reuse in museums and those sorts of things. But there was nothing really, I suppose, that shifted the element too much. We've sort of had to bring in other elements to make sure that the trees have sort of been able to get adequate levels of water. Putting a basement on the high side of a tree somewhat has potentially shifted some of that subterranean aqua sort of supply that it used to have. So we've sort of had to make sure that we've got irrigation elements to make sure that those trees are getting adequate water. But yeah, I think generally it's all pretty well as is. Would you agree, Matt? Or?
Yeah, it probably worth mention. Well, important to mention is there was a whole body of work that was done prior to our involvement. The rezoning, there was a master plan prepared for the rezoning, which had begun to grapple with all of these issues and the right moves for the master plan. Our work refined that and built on it. So that was done by the Inglis's in collaboration with council and the government architect at the time.
Now, William, your work is always beautifully crafted and beautifully detailed. I know I'm talking about your work in general, not just on this project. What always intrigues me is the ability to realise that level of design resolution and finish in a commercial development. And I suppose, how do you maintain that level of quality control so that it doesn't get lost once the value management and the cost cutting needs to inevitably come? Because this is a commercial development. It needs to work. So how do you argue your point for the architecture?
It's a really tough question, Andrew. Firstly, I would say that we don't always get it great. There's a lot of things that haven't turned out as good as I would like. But on these projects, we've learned to document well and then invest a lot of time when it comes to construction to leading to the best outcome possible. And then also to kind of design a building that's very robust and able to withstand the pressures of a design and construct contract. So that means focus on a few things that are going to be really special, build lots of tolerance into the design, and hold on to those things. And in this case, the precast paneling on the outside of the building was going to give its distinctive character, and the balustrades and the upstands. And then when it came to other forms of glazing, it's quite standard in a way. And in doing that, you're able to focus with the builder on the things that make a difference and allow a more standard approach to other elements. And then the same would apply to interiors as well. There'd be parts of it that we're really focused on, other parts that we think let's hold back on that and keep that quite standardized. And then the last sort of comment about that is it all fits into a body of work where we're constantly refining the way we do, say, for example, door frames, and trying to improve that and learn from past mistakes and bring that forward to the next project. So there are levels of consistency that run through the various projects that we do, and we can leverage off the lessons learned in the past.
Now, the work we saw tonight was obviously stage one. In Alex's presentation, there's the suggestion of further stages. And Matt, I know that if you go to the website, it talks about SJB and Neeson-Mercatnelli coming on board for future designs. This idea of having a stable, what of another word, a stable of very, very good architects to go across the site so that it's not all with one hand, but with many different hands. It'd be good to talk about the philosophy behind that idea.
Yeah, that is one of the unique elements of this project, not unique insofar as bringing multiple architects together, but unique in the sense that we actually did the designs for all of the buildings, so all three stages simultaneously, all at once. And what normally happens in a staged master plan development is you'll get an approval for the master plan where the envelopes are approved, and then one by one the project team will design a stage, and those departments will be sold and it'll be built, and then you'll move on to the next one. And that creates a kind of design culture where you're almost reacting to the stage that came before you rather than collaboratively thinking about the joint outcome. So it was a really interesting process that we got together with Arcadia, ourselves, Smart Design Studio, SJB and Neeson-Mercatnelli all together, and did a bunch of collaboration workshops early to try and think about or align ourselves around the themes that would guide all of our architecture. Now, they don't all look the same. They all have a distinct aesthetic, but they have, you'll see when the second stage comes online, while this stage one has this precast concrete element tying it together, the second stage has a lot of brickwork and is much more kind of modest and domestic in its scale to respond to the context, the struggle town. It's right in the heart of the struggle town conservation area, so it's responding to the kind of scale and domestic quality of its immediate context. Whereas this is immediately alongside the more institutional buildings of the schools and the hospital.
Now we've started getting some questions coming through on the chat, which is great. Paul Convoy's noted that yes, this was part of Struggle Town, poor Irish labourers and gardeners working for the Pierce family in the mid-19th century. So that might be part of that earlier heritage and history that we were looking for. I've got a question here from Halleck asking, was there any consideration of extending the north-south pedestrian link across Barca Street via a pedestrian crossing? Really interesting presentation, thank you. I'm not sure, that's probably a question for either Alex or Matt.
Yeah, I can take that. We certainly tabled where the pedestrian crossing was going to go, and basically because of the use of the roads, the ambulance station, and the emergency, we were pretty restricted. There's also a driveway that's on the western edge of the school that needed to be respected. So it was basically decided to retain it at the Wombat crossing at the edge of the roundabout where it is now, so that there wasn't additional conflict and confusion really for both pedestrians and vehicles.
We've got another question here about the fig trees, about what the lifespan you'd expect of those fig trees. I mean, they're obviously, it's nice to see that the fig trees have been respected here. There's other parts of this part of town where the fig trees weren't heavily respected. So it's nice to see they are. They're obviously already quite old. How many more years are we hope to get out of these trees?
That's a very good question. I'd expect you'd be looking to, come close to the 200 mark. So they've still got, they'll outlive me, I'd imagine.
So they might outlive the buildings, maybe. Okay. Interesting question here from Anthony Kemeny. Did you need to challenge the master plan metrics, or were they immediately acceptable for both developer and designer? And I guess this is this balance between maximising floor space, but also making sure we've got amenity and livability. Generally, the development is fairly low rise. I mean, there's been talk in other parts of Randwick of 20 rows of 25-storey high towers. So this is all quite modest in terms of its scale. But yeah, how did it stack up in terms of the metrics for the developer versus the placemaking for the architecture?
I can take that one, Andrew. I think so I mentioned earlier that the rezoning proposal preceded our work, and that it's at that rezoning stage, which is where the amount of floor space essentially that can go on the site is determined. And so we inherited, I think, what was a very good and appropriate density for this type of development, with a maximum of 8 stories, and in the latter stages, buildings that come down to 2 stories alongside the existing buildings, and added to that a bunch of open space. So there was no tension in how much floor space should go on there, because when we came on board, that was already determined. But there was obviously some pushing and pulling about where the height should go. And what you see in this first stage is the tallest buildings in the whole development. It only gets lower from here as we go closer to the smaller houses. Right.
But is it, I mean, I'd imagine though it's still a reasonable density for the overall site. I mean, would you, it still certainly fits into the idea of medium to high density? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's the FSR of 1.65 overall, or 1.6. So it's a long time since I had that number in my mind.
It's interesting. There's always this discussion that high density means high rise, and it's of course quite incorrect. There are, some of the densest cities in the world, like Copenhagen and Paris, don't necessarily, or Barcelona, don't necessarily have rows and rows of high rise, and yet achieve quite high density. I think the only reason developers like high rise is because you get better views. But you're disconnected from the ground, and I think that's one of the big pluses with what you've got here, is that there's, even on the top, you still got you could talk to someone on the ground, and I think that's really important for any kind of multi-residential. Got another comment here from Kerry Hammer. Did any of you have any input into the external design of the childcare centre extension on the heritage building in Newmarket House? Any comments about how the extension and change of use will impact on the visual amenity of the heritage precinct?
I haven't had any involvement. I did see an early design of it, which looked to my eye a relatively complementary addition. But yeah, I haven't seen the final approval drawings.
Okay.
Yeah, we weren't involved either.
Okay, I think we've just about gone through all the questions. Now, can I ask Leo, how much longer time-wise have we got? When do I need to wrap things up?
I'm happy to continue till 8, so 10 more minutes.
Okay, all right. So if you've got any more, here we are. I've got a comment here from Paul Convoy. Convey, sorry. The big stables building would perhaps be an excellent arts centre or regional arts gallery, something lacking in Randwick. It might also help, like the site to the 2 adjoining state excellent high schools. So there's a thought for council. Perhaps it could be turned into an arts centre. So if you've got any more questions, please send them through. Have a look at my notes here. One thing that interests me is the layering of history. Whenever there's no such thing as a greenfield site in the city anymore. That there's memories of things before, and sometimes those memories have a strong heritage significance, and we need to look after them. But other times, it's perhaps it's something to bounce your ideas off, and it's I think Alex actually mentioned the cultural value of certain things that necessarily have a fine heritage value. But I know myself as an architect, the most terrifying thing is to be given a flat site with nothing on it, that's where everything's been bulldozed, and they say, go for it. And you go, well, I've got nothing to respond to. So that idea of responding and bouncing and being pushed and pulled around by all the things that are there, or whether you need to be or not, that's certainly been a big part of the design of this. Could you perhaps, one of you, sort of have a bit of a chat about that?
I might start off just by saying that every site, no matter how green or brown the site might be, has things like climate that would play a major influence on how you orientate buildings. And in this case, our commission came in after the master plan had been set. So the master plan had established a sideline between Barca Road and the old stables, and orientations of the buildings in north and south, and respect for important trees and other heritage buildings. So I guess we were given a framework in a way, but our kind of view on it was respond to the first principle would be to respond to the environment. And then after that, you could build on the history. But that's probably a little bit different to what you were asking. And perhaps Matt and Alex, you might like to feed in on that.
I can throw one other tidbit in there, which relates to, I think we've talked a lot about the horse racing history on this site. And I think one of the questioners made the comment about the Struggletown Conservation Area. When you move west from this site into the Struggletown Conservation Area, you find a little piece of urban fabric which is very different from anywhere else in Sydney. It's a series of very modest buildings, all that are built differently and separately. A lot of Sydney is made up of terrace house rows, bits of urban fabric that built in more, comprehensive groupings. It was those early observations of the character of Struggletown which actually informed the ideas around the collaboration framework and getting multiple architects to contribute to the precinct as a whole. We knew from the outset that one set of buildings that all look the same running all the way through the site was not going to be compatible at all with the Struggletown context. And for those of you that are on the call that come and use the park, I'd really encourage you to just walk down Middle Street and have a look through that little area. It's a really magical, modest part of the city.
This is a good question from Roger. He notes that early on, there was a fair bit of community opposition to the project because it was perceived to be an overdevelopment. What sort of feedback or what's the response from the community been now that the first stage has been opened and people can start using it and seeing it?
We don't get a lot of direct feedback from the community once these projects are handed over.
Nobody's trolling you on Twitter or anything like that? Or? No,
maybe a mechanism for better feedback. Look, I must admit, I take great pride in winning the People's Choice Award at the Randwick Design Awards. As much as I like architecture awards, to me, the fact that you pick up a People's Choice says the best possible things about the kinds of projects you do. So that's positive feedback I've heard.
Okay, one last question. Now, as architects and landscape architects in the last couple of years, the whole idea of designing for country and thinking about country and thinking about that this land has been occupied for 50, 60, maybe 1,000 or more years, and there was a whole ecology underway long before we started building cities. And now we're all being asked as designers to think about country and incorporate ideas of country and to talk to and collaborate with local, whether they're land council groups or local elders and such. And I've noticed, I think Alex did mention that there were some Indigenous artefacts found on site. I'd just like to know, was there any consultation in talking to the local Indigenous groups with this site, or are you looking at it for future parts of the site?
I think if I'm to be honest, it's probably one of the elements that that we would definitely approach differently in future if we were to have another crack at it. There are some elements that I suppose respond to country. For us, country is two things, or connecting to it is connecting to the cultural component of First Nations people, and then it's connecting to country itself. So from a landscape perspective, our planting typologies and the like has somewhat responded to that, and caring for, with the retention of the trees and looking to create microclimates and those sorts of elements. But in terms of the cultural side to it, I think we probably could have looked a little bit harder. You had two very, very strong competing things though at that point in time, in terms of a site that has a significantly unique cultural heritage that really demanded a lot of canvas. But not to say we couldn't improve, for sure we could. And consultation, I suppose, wasn't required at that point in time. It's a significantly different approach to design with Arcadia now. Every project has consultation and acknowledgement and consideration for country.
Yeah, I think reflecting on that question is that, I'm really, it hits home how far we've moved in that space as an industry and as a society in the last 5 years since this was originally designed. While it was, it was acknowledged at the time, it was with such a strong European heritage that contributed heavily to the character of the place. It was difficult to incorporate in the context at the time, and as Alex said, we would definitely be more strongly considering the traditional interpretation of country in a design if we're doing the same thing again today.
Yeah, well, hopefully that can be another layer added to the next phases of the project to bring that in. Look, we're at 8 o'clock. I think it's probably just about time to wrap up. So if you could all do some virtual applause for our speakers tonight. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, William. Great talk. I've been reading all the feedback here, and it's all very, very positive. So I think everyone's really learned a lot about it, and I think they've gained a new respect for how modern architecture and modern landscape and urban design can deliver livable and good outcomes, but still give us the density that we need to make our city move forward. So thank you very much. Thank you, Randwick Council, for making these talks happen again. I think they're a great initiative, and I think they're a great way of just connecting architecture and landscape architecture and design with the greater populace, so that people can actually so it becomes a bit more demystified and actually understand how we go about doing what we do. So thank you all, and we'll see you for the next talk whenever that is. Bye-bye.
Thank you.